So this is a pretty unusual situation wherein it seems we've actually been given an official answer to a pretty long-standing question that we've had ever since the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. So long-standing, in fact, that I have already made a video on this topic quite some time ago, and it seems like answers to that particular question were always very in demand, as to this day that's still one of the most popular videos on my channel. And that question is, of course, what's the deal with Kenpachi Zaraki's previous vice captain, Yachiru Kusajishi? Based on the events of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, is she in fact his zanpakuto spirit, or is she something totally separate? And it does seem like we now finally have an answer. Before we begin, I just want to thank the members of my community who brought this to light to me, who made me aware of this. I really appreciate it. However, I also want to give a shout out to where I first heard about this question being answered, which was on an excellent video by a fellow Bleach YouTuber who goes by the name of Simo Urahara. Now, Simo Urahara is a friend of mine. He does amazing work over there on his channel. And like I said, this is where I actually first heard about this. So I'm going to leave the link to his video in the description. Make sure to go and check it out and go and support him over there. If you love Bleach, you'll undoubtedly love what he does there. He does really great work. And of course, before we begin, if you haven't subscribed here yet, make sure to do that now. You're in the perfect place for Bleach content like this every single week. Also, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, because it really does help get the video out to more Bleach fans just like yourselves. I'd really appreciate that exposure and that push. And of course, if you want to help support the channel even more, we do have a Patreon now where you can support me for as little as $1 a month, and you can get early access to videos. And of course, as always, just a massive thank you goes out to everyone who is supporting me over there already. I really appreciate it. So there's this very exclusive club called Klub Outside, where Kubo occasionally posts exclusive unique artworks, and also does a question and answer with fans who can kind of send in anything for him to answer, and if he does or not is up to him, I think. And someone asked him about Yachiru and Kenpachi's actual relationship, the relationship she has to NOZARASHI, which I think is a pretty good question to ask, because clearly people wanted to know, and it does seem like Kubo has actually given us an answer. Now, like I said, I've already done a video on this topic, and in that video I said that I very much subscribed to the theory that she was NOZARASHI through and through. She was just his zanpakuto spirit, and that was basically all there was to it. And it turns out that I was kind of half right, but also kind of wrong as well. What's interesting about this scenario, however, is that it seems like most theories were wrong, but also everybody kind of wins. Another theory people had was, which I also brought up in that video, was that Kenpachi and Yachiru was a Stark and Lilinet situation where they had to separate because they had so much power, and it created a second being, essentially. I dismissed that in my video to my detriment, because apparently that's also kind of right, but also kind of wrong. And that's what I mean by everybody winning here. Everyone's theories have kind of coalesced to create the truth, essentially, which is really neat. So, to break it down as simply as possible, Kubo says in his answer to this person, basically, the true spirit of NOZARASHI, Kenpachi's zanpakuto, is actually an adult woman. Yachiru, or the being that would become Yachiru, the little pink-haired girl, is somehow separated from this original being a long time ago and materializes in the soul world. So far, that sounds about right to me. That's where the Stark and Lilinet comparisons come in. It seems like NOZARASHI, for whatever reason, split and sent this, and somehow the little girl version of NOZARASHI went into the spirit world and would have eventually come face to face with Zaraki himself. I have a couple of thoughts on this. We've never really heard of anything like this before. As I mentioned in my previous video on this topic, generally speaking, in the canon manga, the only time a zanpakuto spirit externalizes in the real world is when a Shinigami is trying to learn Bankai and they are forcing them to submit. But it has happened before. Outside of a situation like this, Zabimaru, for instance, appears to Renji in the Soul Society arc because he wants to keep fighting Ichigo, essentially. He isn't called out or anything, he just appears. And also, we know Katen Kyokotsu appears to Kyoraku when he uses Bankai. In both of these scenarios, though, I have to wonder if anyone but the Shinigami in question can actually see this being. We know that Lil Baro cannot see Katen Kyokotsu when Kyoraku is in Bankai. He's questioning who Kyoraku is talking to. And personally, I'm kind of wondering if anyone else can actually see Zabimaru or not. I think there's a scene when Renji arrives to train with Zabimaru to learn Bankai that people can see it, but again, he's trying to learn Bankai. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on here. Yachiru does seem to be still a very unique case, being real enough to actually get a position as vice captain where no one really thinks there's anything strange about her or different about her, and she integrates with the 11th Division absolutely fine. So this is still completely uncharted territory for characters as far as I'm concerned. But the idea of there being an adult woman and a young Yachiru both essentially being Nozarashi actually does make a lot of sense to me and answers a couple of questions I had in that previous video. One of my main points of contention about the argument of her being his zanpakuto spirit was when he finally unlocks his zanpakuto, essentially in Muken after training with Unohana. Why doesn't Kenpachi recognize the voice that calls out to him? You would think if it were Yachiru, he would know it immediately. The idea that it is instead this adult woman talking to him makes considerably more sense, and it also explains why Yachiru herself doesn't vanish until much later on. Kenpachi is currently only communing with the original Nozarashi herself. In his answer, Kubo says that probably the easiest way to visualize this relationship is to liken it to Zangetsu and Tensa Zangetsu, what we formerly believed to be essentially the representations of Ichigo's Shikai and Bankai, which is exactly what I think is happening here, and that's why I think Kubo chose that comparison to make it easiest to visualize. It makes total sense to me that this supposed adult version, this adult woman, Nozarashi would be Kenpachi's Shikai, while the being we know as Yachiru would be his Bankai, and that's actually, again, something I brought up in the previous video. And that makes a ton of sense to me, because Yachiru appears when Kenpachi needs her the most against Gerard Valkyrie, and quite literally hands him the power of Bankai. So it makes sense to me that she would represent that side of his zanpakuto, again, much like Tensa Zangetsu was originally believed to be, the younger, newer side, which is why she is a young being. Honestly, so far, so good as far as I'm concerned. This is so far making a lot of sense, except Kubo goes one step further and things start to get a bit confusing again, in my opinion. In his answer to this person's question, I think Kubo is trying to also answer the fact that Yachiru has access seemingly to a zanpakuto of her own, Sanpo Kenju, which is again something we brought up in the previous video. Kubo says that when the two of them met in Rukongai and Zaraki named her Yachiru, that also gave her Shinigami powers of her own. And that is just a whole can of worms, in my opinion. Things are getting really weird now. Like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but let's try and break it down. So we know, thanks to Ichibei Hyosobei, that the power of all things resides in the name. And we know that Ichibei is the one who knows all names, who has bestowed everything in Soul Society's history with its name. So to give this little girl the name Yachiru and imbue her with Shinigami powers, while it's kind of weird, it also does sort of make sense. However, what I don't understand is, can anyone do this? Or is it just because Kenpachi is massively powerful? That's kind of weird to me, because I thought it was supposed to be Ichibei's special thing. I think there's potentially a ton to unpack here, and I don't want to get too convoluted. But I also wonder if the name of the person has an impact on what's happening here, because obviously Kenpachi knows Yachiru to be Yachiru Unohana, this bloodthirsty master of 8,000 styles, this original criminal. And I wonder if a part of that nature, the nature of the person whose name Kenpachi is bestowing, then feeds into this little girl, perhaps. Or maybe not. Maybe it's got nothing to do with that. That's what I mean by it being quite confusing. And also, I didn't even know Shinigami could do this. We know that when a Shinigami is presented with an Asauchi, an empty blade essentially, that they go on to imprint their soul upon it. And that is how it becomes a zanpakuto, essentially, with a Shikai. Because the Shikai is supposed to represent the literal embodiment of that Shinigami's soul. So, I guess a couple of questions we need to ask. I'm guessing Kenpachi obviously does not know the name of his zanpakuto even now. It's not like it's something he knew and then forgot. He has never spoken to this sword. We know that he picks this blade up off a corpse, and I can only assume it is totally empty at this point, because that's not really how zanpakuto work. You know, Ichigo... I don't think that Ichigo could kill Renji and then use Zabimaru, because it's not his soul. It would go back to being an empty katana. So Kenpachi has killed someone, and like a vulture, like Oetsu says, he picks up this blade and takes it for his own. And then you have to assume that he goes through many years just not talking to this sword at all. So here's what I'm wondering, and what actually would make a lot of sense to me, is that as Kenpachi is getting older, he clearly has a ton of Reiatsu, and this Zanpakuto wants to get to know him. However, he is completely deaf to the cries of Nozarashi. This adult woman is like, he's like, talk to me, and he's just not doing it. So, I could personally totally envision Nozarashi like just tearing out some of her own power and materializing it in the spirit world so that it actually talks to Kenpachi. That's what I'm assuming. That's why I think Yachiru finds Zaraki, why she touches the blade. Kenpachi then gives her the name Yachiru, which apparently turns her into a Shinigami. That's the part that I think is really weird. I guess if you really simplify it, because Unohana is a Shinigami, maybe giving Yachiru her name gives her a Shinigami powers. That's maybe it. And maybe that's why Sanpo Kenju is a really weird Shikai, at least according to Isane. You can see why we're going in a lot of circles here, why it's really weird despite actually being given what seems to be a concrete answer. The question posed on Klub Outside actually mentions this idea of, we've seen in the past many Zanpakuto, or some Zanpakuto, that don't perform to their maximum power if they are given some kind of bastardized or false version of their name. So, you know, Fuji Kujaku and Ruriro Kujaku is the most obvious example, but also Renji with Hihio Zabimaru and Soo Zabimaru. So is that going on here as well? Kenpachi has kind of named his Zanpakuto unwittingly Yachiru, but it's actually Nozarashi. I don't really know. That's really throwing me. And honestly, if you guys have any insight whatsoever into this whole situation about Kenpachi giving her Shinigami powers, any opinions, anything like that, please leave them in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going, because I would love to hear what you have to say. My final question about this as well, and I think this is probably pretty self-explanatory, does Nozarashi look just like an older version of Yachiru? I'm guessing she probably does, probably still has the pink hair, but she's like a mature woman, much in the same way as Zangetsu and Tensa Zangetsu worked. The Zangetsu example is a weird one, because we know now that that wasn't like true, that wasn't Ichigo's Shinigami powers, but it's still the best comparison we have, which is why I think Kubo chose to use that one. And that's basically it for my video on this topic. Let's just very quickly summarize what we kind of know for sure. Nozarashi's Zanpakuto spirit is actually an adult woman. That must be the voice that Kenpachi actually hears in Muken. However, we've only got to this stage because Nozarashi split itself at some point and sent out this little girl into the spirit world, who Kenpachi then named Yachiru, and doing so somehow gave her Shinigami powers, perhaps something to do with Ichibei, or it's something to do with the idea of a Shinigami imprinting themselves on an empty blade. That bit is speculation, but at the very least we do now have a slightly better idea of this, and I'm really appreciative of that. And I would love it if Kubo was able to answer even more questions like this. But for now, I'm really happy that this does make a little more sense. It makes a ton of sense to me to imagine the adult woman, who's probably an adult version of Yachiru, as the Shikai, and little girl Yachiru that we know so well as the Bankai. That makes the whole thing make more sense to me in my mind. It's really only this notion of bestowing upon her Shinigami powers that I find a little bit weird, but as I said before, all power is in names, so maybe it does make sense. I don't really know. Let me know in the comments below what you think about that bit in particular, but as I said, it's nice to finally have some kind of an answer. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Let me know, like I said, in the comments what you think really is going on in regards to Kenpachi bestowing Shinigami powers upon little girl Yachiru, who's technically his zanpakuto spirit, but there is also a Stark and Lilinet thing going on. Like I said before, thank you to everyone who let me know about this. I really appreciate it. It was a fun thing to discuss, even though I'm still not completely satisfied with the answer we have. At least some of it now makes a lot more sense. And make sure to go and check out Simo Urahara's video as well. The link is in the description. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.